I never pictured my first trip to DC would be like this.
We've got Cloé, who works at Ubisoft and did a lot of the research that went into the Division 2, and Tricia, who is a disaster expert. When you see a game like the Division 2, do you see it as something that could potentially be inspirational to agencies and organizations to fend off some of the issues that we may face?
Well, I think, first of all, the game is a game, right?
Yeah.
So it's not a simulation.
Yes.
But the extent to which I was really impressed was their ability to incorporate what we know actually happens in disaster events and to ground truth it in what people actually do.
Are you ever concerned when you're working with this fiction and mining into this data? Like, do you find stuff that is just too shocking for you to, know, and you just slam the book closed and say, "Oh my God, I don't want to get into that"?
Well, we worked on severe thematic, and we wanted our factions to be grounded into reality. We draw a lot of details into the agent and the world, and I think the possibility as well that everyone can be a hero and an agent of the Division resonate with people because they ask themselves what would they do in times of crisis. Would they act like an agent? Would they act like just someone in the settlement and try to rebuild the society in the good way? What would they do is also a question that we like the player to ask themselves.
Chad Chatterton is one of the lead environment artists working on the Division 2, and you also worked on the Division 1. This is such a pristine city when you walk around and you just look at the preservation of it all and its respect for history. And I'm wondering, as you're destroying Washington, D.C., as game developers and movie makers love to do, if there's ever this moment of like, should we do that? It feels wrong to like throw a missile into that building. Did you ever have second thoughts, or did it feel like, oh man, this is fun?
I mean, we think that through all the time, actually. And we didn't, for example, recreate the World War II monument that you see at the end of the reflecting pool near the Washington Monument. We changed that and created a different kind of memorial. We have some deference to the symbols of Washington, D.C., but that's what we're working with. We're working with those symbols, those iconic landmarks, and the enemy factions within the narrative of the plot are also working with them for the same reasons.
Right.
The main point is that we always strive to make it plausible. So even though it's a fantasy and it's a fantastic and extreme situation, we always try and abide by a logic.
Our capital is falling.
Tricia, what do you think is the most horrific catastrophes that has happened in recent years that we should be warned by and try to never have to face again?
Well, I think what's most worrisome is what hasn't happened.
Yeah.
And it's trying to imagine that there are places that might be exposed to new types of risks, new types of uncertainty that they're unfamiliar with. I remember a number of years ago here in DC when there was an earthquake and you had all these people who were running out of the buildings. If you were in California, you knew that wasn't what to do. Yeah. And it was a small event. But understanding how we look at those disasters in a certain way, and if something is different, it might actually cause more risks. Our society is so much tied to these tightly coupled systems. Relying on a breakdown in one system might affect another system. The fact that we have these transboundary vulnerabilities where it's not just a matter of the threats that are localized, but how we are connected with each other across the country and around the world. I think that really stretches our imagination, and we don't quite yet know what the threats are. And if we aren't able to imagine it, it's very difficult to prepare.
I'm wondering if Washington, D.C. and New York look like this, what does the rest of the world in your fiction look like?
Well, I mean, it is. We think of it as a global pandemic, and that's one of the reasons why when you go to the residential areas in Washington, D.C., in the Division 2, you'll see even bigger piles of trash than you saw in Division 1, even better. But that's because some people say they couldn't evacuate, but some people didn't bother evacuating because where would they go? It's also terrible out there. And we do hint at that in Division 2. We have evacuation routes planned throughout the city, which are based on actual evacuation routes in D.C. And you'll notice that the cars are all facing one direction in accordance with those evacuation routes. Any cars that are parked on the streets will have their petrol caps open and a rag hanging out, so they've been drained.
Was there any truth in the idea of the Division as a sort of civilian group that's ready to be activated? Was there any research that led you in that direction when you were building these games?
We took a lot of inspiration from Dark Winter, this exercise that show how unprepared the government was to face that type of bioterrorism threat. So we built a lot on research and plausible threats to make sure that we have a logical and consistent scenarios.
Tricia, have you ever heard of a force maybe beyond like the Army Reserve or people helping? Is there another group that would be able to jump in and help, or is it really just up to civilians at that point?
There's been a lot of work in probably the past 10 years in trying to mobilize civilians before a disaster happens. Organizations like Citizen Corps or the Medical Reserve Corps. So identifying people in the community who can get pre-trained to a certain extent. They're not only volunteering, and that's really important in a disaster, but they become familiar with some of the protocols, some of the procedures, that officials are a little bit more aware of the ways that they can fill in.
Sort of like Guardian Angels or Neighborhood Watch, but for in the worst case scenario.
Right, and they do work around the country. So, any community, you can look up your Citizen Corps, Medical Reserve Corps, and they do work from flu vaccinations and public health information, but then they're ready if a disaster happens.
You guys have spent a lot of time in the lore and in the manufacture of just a terrible reality in this game. It's like the Tom Clancy nightmare. I mean, he always, I think, as an author and as a storyteller, would sort of posit these potential things, but you guys took it over the line and you've made it awful. And I'm wondering, from your perspective, how does humanity win its way back after an event like this?
Well, I think in contrast with the first game, there's even more hope in the form of the settlements, because you're working with civilians who are banding together. People arise who have certain skills and uses. The network of the civilians means that the whole is greater than the sum of the parts, I guess is how you'd put it. And everything you're doing in the game through the missions and the side missions and so on is connected to bettering those settlements and trying to restore order.
I think a lot of times we see too many disaster movies where everything goes wrong, and the reality is that there's an incredible amount of pro-social behavior of people helping each other, not just neighbors helping neighbors, but neighbors helping complete strangers, sharing resources, thinking about new ways to respond in a disaster, to use what they have, and it can be really inspiring.
Coming to DC on the research trips, we first went back to Massive, went back to the studios, and did some R&D graphical benchmarks. So we recreated the White House. We looked at DuPont Underground, for example, and there's a few other areas like this, and we tried to see where we can push the graphics in contrast to the Division 1. Right. So what can we do to get this hot summer feel? What can the flooding that DC is so subject to, what can that mean in the environments? And of course, how does nature feature? Because that's the real challenge.
Nature wins, right?
It comes back. It reclaims its own. And we did quite a few new things with Division 2. We had this dust technology, for example, so thinking about the state of the world being 7 months after the pandemic was released in New York. So we have this tech that just lays dust on everything that you can then draw into, remove the dust as you need to tell micro stories, footprints or whatever. We rely a lot more on natural lighting. We have a new natural lighting system to flood the real-time sunlight into the indoor environments, which we didn't have in Division 1, because there's less power than there was in New York in Division 1. So we wanted to have less electrical powered lighting and more natural lighting, and so the technology and features work in line with that.
It turned out to be a death trap.
Is it surreal for you to be here again?
It is.
After you've almost finished the game. I mean, we're days away from this thing going gold and being out there. And you're back, but now you know this city intimately because you've been building it again. Yeah, we're constantly feeling that sense of, I don't know what you call it, it's not deja vu, but when you've been playing a game for maybe too long and you walk outside and you feel you're still in the game.
Yes.
Yeah. We are obsessed with dystopian sort of fantasy in our entertainment. Why do you think that is, Tricia?
I think it pushes our imagination. Fortunately, most of us haven't experienced a disaster or something that's really catastrophic. It's a way for us to not only escape, but to be thinking about our own strengths, thinking about how we might overcome our own weakness. It's a way for us to safely explore those questions that doesn't necessarily prepare us fully when something happens, but it begins helping us think through those issues and think about how might I do in that circumstance.
Let's hope nothing like this ever happens in real life.